5 meaningful minutes, thinking today about the number 70. In this week's Parshat Devarim, Moshe begins his final speech to the Jewish people. And the Torah writes, Be'ever Yarden Be'eretz Moav, across the Jordan, the land of Moav, Ho'il Moshe Be'eret Torah Zot Lemor. Moshe began to explain this Torah. And Rashi takes issue or wonders about the idea that Moshe is explaining Be'er et the Torah. What is he explaining? Just giving over the Torah. And Rashi makes a surprising comment here and says, Be'er et the Torah, explaining the Torah, B'shiv'im lashon pirsha lahem. He explained it in 70 languages. This is surprising, but even more surprising is at the end of Sefer Devarim, when he's wrapping up the speech, again the Torah says, Be'er Moshe explained these words, and again Rashi says, B'shivim lashon, in 70 languages. So Rashi's sticking to it. The idea that Moshe interpreted the Torah into 70 languages. And when we think about the number 70, where else does it appear in our tradition? All over the place. Think about the places. I challenge you to send me a note with one or two that I am not going to mention right now, because there's so many instances of the 70 in Jewish tradition. 70 appears where we have the Shivim Zikenim, 70 elders, that eventually become the Sanhedrin. And even though the predominant opinion is that the Sanhedrin was 71, there is an opinion in the Gemara that it was just 70. 71 was perhaps a way of interpreting Moshe's role on the Sanhedrin. There were 70 bull sacrifices brought on Sukkot. There were 70 folks that went down to Egypt with Yaakov's family. There were 70 years of exile between after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. There's 70 holy days, according to the Midrash, in our Jewish calendar. If you count up the 52 Shabbatot, 14 days for Pesach and Sukkot, another couple of days for Shavuot and Shmini Atzeret, and then another couple of days for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Of course, it's fudgeable a little bit. Rosh Hashanah became 2 days. The diaspora has 8 for these, but the idea remains the same. We have 70 names of Hashem in rabbinic literature. 70, say the rabbis, is the gematria of Adam and Chava. Adam v'Chava. Meaning that somehow the first couple embody the number 70 that will be transmitted to all of humanity. And of course, the idea that there were 70 different nations of the world, perhaps 70 different languages that came out of the Tower of Babel story. And in Tehillim, in the 90th chapter, is the idea that 70 is a full life. If you live to 80, you're doing great, says David HaMelech. And of course, from the Haggadah, playing on this idea, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who's afraid that he won't be taken seriously when he's appointed at a young age to head up the courts, and he wakes up in the morning with a white beard. He says, wow, I am like Shivim Shana, I'm like 70 years old. So you see all of these 70s, and one of the questions is, what is the common thread? What unites them? What is the metaphor of 70? What does it symbolize in our tradition? And there are perhaps many different answers. But one answer is the idea that 70 is the notion of diversity. 70 is Shivim Panim LaTorah. There are 70 faces to the Torah, 70 ways that we interpret our text, 70 interpretations or translations from Moshe. 70 represents the nations of the world. 70 represents the fullness of a court to be able to decide serious matters. 70 were the bull sacrifices of Sukkot, in which we were thinking of all the nations of the world. So 70 has this idea, this value that we have to think beyond ourselves, to think of others, to include other opinions, to include other voices. Tonight, tomorrow begin the 9 days, Rosh Chodesh Av, as we move towards Tisha B'Av, in a time where we think thoughtfully about what happens when we shut out other voices, when Sinat Chinam, baseless hatred, overrules, and when we can create Ahavat Chinam, when we can create love that is flowing and inclusive of other voices, and brings the fullness of Shivim Panim, 70 faces, which is of course a metaphor for all the faces together around the table.